Welcome to today's webinar on SSO and MFA for the Oracle E-Business Suite without the complexity. My name is Phil Ryman. I'm the moderator for this e-learning session. Our speaker today is Steve Coast. Steve is a Chief Technology Officer and founder of Integrigy Corporation. He's been working with Oracle products since 1994. For the past 16 years, Steve has focused on the security and auditing aspects of the Oracle E-Business Suite and the Oracle database, and has written and presented on these topics at various national and regional conferences. Steve is recognized internationally for his vast security knowledge and expertise. I'll now turn it over to Steve.
Thanks so much, Phil. Today we're going to talk about single sign-on and multi-factor authentication with the Oracle Business Suite. And we're going to talk about how to do this without the complexity. A lot of Oracle Business Suite customers struggle with implementing multi-factor authentication and or single sign-on with Oracle Business Suite because it requires additional software, hardware, and it's actually fairly difficult to set up. Anyone who's actually been through the process knows it's not an easy task. It can work and does work for a lot of organizations, but it is fairly time-consuming and a lot of work to make it function correctly at the end of the day. So we're going to talk about an alternate method to actually implement SSO and MFA with Oracle Business Suite. But first we'll talk about SSO and MFA, some of the benefits, why you should be implementing it if you already haven't. Before we get started, a little background about Integrigy for those of you not familiar with us. Integrigy was founded in 2002 by former Big Six consultants. We're an Oracle Business Suite firm first, security second. So we come at this understanding Oracle Business Suite very well, and then layer in security on top of it. All we do is security for Oracle Business Suite, as well as for PeopleSoft and databases. We help our clients secure Oracle Business Suite a couple different ways. First, we have two products, one being AppSentry, which is, think of the Secure Configuration Console, the Secure Configuration Guide that we wrote for Oracle. Think of those on steroids. That's what AppSentry does, is it validates the security of the Oracle Business Suite environment, as well as your other standalone databases, performs hundreds of checks to verify that you've done the configuration, installation, and you operate it in a secure manner. We'll touch base on our AppDefend product today, but it's an enterprise application firewall for Oracle Business Suite and PeopleSoft. This is the proactive layer of protection. How do you protect Oracle Business Suite? How do you virtually patch those security vulnerabilities? We also have a world-class consulting team that performs security assessments. We work with a number of clients to help them on their compliance challenges, especially around SOX, GDPR. And we also help our clients implement products like Oracle Transparent Data Encryption, Oracle Database Vault, Audit Vault, Imperva, Guardium. Truly, how do you get value out of those security tools with Oracle Business Suite? A lot of organizations just implement what they think is a silver bullet without spending the proper time around requirements and design of those products and how to truly get value. Because again, you have a lot of tools in your security ecosystem. How do those operate with Oracle Business Suite? And we spend a lot of time and effort with our clients on how to get value out of the security tools, how to make those truly effective with Oracle Business Suite. And finally, we're backed up by a world-class research team. We found more security vulnerabilities in Oracle Business Suite than anyone else out there. We actively research, work with Oracle Business Suite every day to find out the issues, the challenges in the application. Where are there security vulnerabilities? How do those security vulnerabilities come about, and how do you actually solve those? And finally, we have a very good relationship with Oracle. We're an Oracle Gold partner and work very closely with the Oracle Business Suite team. So enough about Integrigy. Let's kind of dive into the topic. A lot of acronyms today, so kind of want to level set a little bit in terms of those acronyms. First, single sign-on, or SSO. This is the capability and the authentication mechanism to kind of get rid of that hassle of having usernames and passwords for multiple applications. Again, all of us have how many passwords and usernames across so many different web applications that we interact with. In the organization and the enterprise, it's the same. You may have 5, 10 applications that you deal with during your course of your job. You have separate usernames and passwords. This is where single sign-on comes in. The goal of single sign-on is you have a single username and password which allows you to access multiple applications. And in many cases, then you therefore don't have to re-enter those credentials when you access a different application. So that's the goal. The panacea of single sign-on is getting rid of all those multiple usernames and passwords. Let's get down to one. The other layer of authentication is on top of single sign-on, I can now add on multi-factor authentication. And multi-factor authentication says, well, username and password is not good enough. What I need is another layer that in case that username and password is compromised, that someone can't get into the account. That's where multi-factor authentication comes in. When we talk about multi-factor authentication around Oracle Business Suite, we'll mostly be talking around two-factor authentication, where you start with your username and password, and then we'll layer in another access control method on top of that username and password. And typically that's something like a hardware token. It may be your phone authenticator app, application, things like that. And when you talk about factors, you're really looking at three different types of factors. One is what's called knowledge. That's something like a password. I know something. I have to know it. Possession is something that I actually have. That may be a hardware token. It may be a device in terms of my mobile phone. Then there's an inherent value, something that I have because who I am. That may be a fingerprint. That may be a retinal scan. Generally, we don't use that type of biometric with Oracle Business Suite. What we're looking typically for is the knowledge-based authentication, username and password, and then a possession, something that I've got like a hardware token or device. So in this presentation, when we talk about multi-factor authentication, we're really referring to two-factor authentication throughout this. Very seldom do we ever work with a client that's implementing more than one factor with Oracle Business Suite besides the username and password. But again, trying to just level set some of the terminology here before we kind of get into the topic. So with Oracle Business Suite, single sign-on provides a lot of benefits. This is where most organizations should be going, trying to get away from some of the issues with local authentication in Oracle Business Suite. First and foremost is trying to increase employee and IT productivity. Again, having multiple passwords and logins to 10 different systems is just not manageable. It doesn't improve your employee satisfaction in terms of having to log in and out of applications. eBusiness Suite may not be their primary application. You may be just going into it for self-service. You may be doing it for expense reports. You may be doing it just monthly or quarterly. Having an additional layer of login and password to a separate application just doesn't increase productivity across the organization. Second, how do you reduce IT costs? Again, having 10 different usernames and passwords across 10 different applications just increases the number of password resets and authentication issues. So in terms of implementing single sign-on, we can actually potentially reduce IT support costs, especially around the help desk in terms of doing password resets. Passwords are a weakness in the organization, so the goal here is to improve security. So if you have 10 applications with 10 different passwords, what's the employee going to do? The first thing they're going to do is start writing some of those down so they don't forget them. So again, you get this password fatigue issue. Password theft is an issue because again, I may be putting on a Post-it note. The worst case scenario is I'm putting on a Post-it note and I'm actually pasting it to my monitor. In reality, that happens not that often, but again, I'm typically writing these down. I'm trying to store them somewhere, especially if those systems that I don't use very often. And then finally, we're trying to improve compliance. The goal here, especially with the Oracle Business Suite, if I don't have this process already enabled, I may have a manual process if an employee is terminated, and I have to go through a manual process to actually terminate them in Oracle Business Suite. How well does that work for a contractor who may have access to Oracle Business Suite that is terminated? Does that flow of information go across the organization? I have Active Directory probably as my single source of truth for identity. That person is typically terminated immediately in Active Directory. That process works well, but does the process work into Oracle Business Suite? Hopefully I've automated that workflow so if they're terminating HR, they're automatically terminating Oracle Business Suite. But when we do our security assessments, this is probably a 30 to 40% per organization risk that we're finding over and over and over that user termination is not done properly or it's not done in a timely manner. Another area on improving compliance where a lot of people miss is Oracle Business Suite does not have good risk-based authentication. Really, there's nothing there in terms of hey, is this login suspicious? Is it a problem? Where you can do that fairly easily in tools like Active Directory, where I can actually say, hey, this user is based in the US and they work 9 to 5 Eastern time. There's this login from our Chinese sales office at 2 a.m. their user time to an application that they very seldom access. Is that a suspicious login? And you can do that with the major identity management platforms like Active Directory. I can now put in that type of risk-based authentication control to say, hey, here's a suspicious login. Here's something wrong with the login. You can't do that in Oracle Business Suite. So we can actually improve the compliance around Oracle Business Suite if I can now connect directly my single sign-on, using single sign-on, Oracle Business Suite to my identity management platform like Active Directory. So there's a lot of benefits in terms of actually doing this. There's a number of solutions out there, but the challenge here is, yes, I get a lot of benefits, but these are not simple solutions to implement. So generally the major supported one by Oracle is Oracle Access Manager, Oracle Internet Directory. Just depending, the older version is Oracle Internet Directory. More modern implementations will use Oracle Access Manager, but again, they're synonymous, replaceable, and perform the same way generally. Again, I need additional hardware. I need additional implementation. Oracle has now released a cloud-based solution. So as part of the Oracle Cloud, I've got Oracle Identity Cloud Service, or IDCS, which is very similar to what Access Manager is doing, the same way with an Oracle supported platform. Instead of using the access gate, it is using EBS Asserter. But again, I'm now another component there. I'm now hooking up. It may not be hardware, but again, it's now in the cloud. I have to have that connection and things like that. There are a couple third-party products out there. There's Okta, SSO Gen, Mini Orange, and there's a couple other products out there in the market. And these all perform about the same way, that I do need an additional hardware platform out there, and they act as the integration. So what ends up happening is, let's say I want to hook up Active Directory to Oracle Business Suite. I have Active Directory, I implement a middleman, such as Oracle Access Manager or SSO Gen, and then that connects to Oracle Business Suite. What we're going to talk about today is the Integrigy AppDefend product, which is a native integration with Oracle Business Suite. AppDefend gets rid of the middleman. AppDefend is a direct connection between Oracle Business Suite and an internet identity provider like Active Directory, Azure AD, or other ones. So with Oracle Business Suite, SSO is not natively supported. Out of the box, I can't go flip a few settings and actually have integration with something like Active Directory. I have to now implement something else. I have to add some things in. Oracle has a solution for this, but again, I need additional hardware, I need additional software, I need that middleman to actually do it all. And generally the way this works is it redirects the login page now to the identity management page. I log in there and then I get redirected back to Oracle Business Suite. It's the general process and flow here. So that's single sign-on. That's the authentication part. So I'm replacing the username and password within Oracle Business Suite. Now, multi-factor authentication is I'm adding in now another layer of authentication. Not only do I need my username and password, I need something else, that additional factor. And traditionally, that's the secure ID token, my phone authenticator application, things like that. The primary goal of multi-factor authentication is to prevent fraud and phishing attacks. So if someone can take over my account by phishing an employee, getting their username and password, how do I thwart that? And that's really the key benefit of multi-factor authentication. If that account password username is compromised, how do I make it very hard for the attacker to actually access the application? And that's where two-factor authentication, adding that additional layer in for identity verification, makes it very hard to do. So we had a client who was having about $500,000 a year in phishing attacks and fraud against their employees. And what they were doing was going in, phishing their username and passwords, going into employee self-service and changing the direct deposit bank account numbers, therefore then stealing the employees' direct deposit. $500,000 a year. By implementing AppDefend with multi-factor authentication, that drops to 0 immediately within the first month. So again, this can be very powerful. So if there is some issues with fraud, with account takeover, this is how you solve it with multi-factor authentication. Because again, I'm now enabling strong authentication. I'm reducing the risk of compromised passwords. Some compliance standards like PCI, which is a payment card industry data security standard, requires multi-factor authentication in many cases. So if you're processing credit cards within Oracle Business Suite, you potentially need to implement multi-factor authentication for accounts that actually have access to those credit cards. Excuse me. In terms of GDPR and HIPAA and some of the other compliance standards, they strongly suggest, and in some cases require, strong authentication. They don't go through and actually say what a strong authentication is, but that is kind of assumed to be multi-factor authentication. And then finally, a key benefit is if you can actually contextualize the authentication. And what contextualize means is if I have a specific data element, a specific action, and an action would be like changing the employee self-service direct deposit bank account numbers. That's a specific action that I can see fraud around. If I can actually contextualize my multi-factor authentication down to that piece of data or that action, that becomes very powerful. So not only does the person log in, but now when they actually try to change a key piece of data that could be fraudulent and things like that, I pop up the two-factor authentication within the application at that point. That becomes a very powerful, effective control to block that type of fraud. So multi-factor authentication has additional benefits on top of SSO. And when we work with organizations, you have a choice. You can implement single sign-on, you can implement multi-factor authentication, or you can implement both, depending on what your security and compliance requirements are, your goals in improving the authentication and security of the environment. You may want to implement one, you may want to implement both, you may want to implement different flavors at different points. And we'll kind of show you some examples of that throughout this presentation. So the popular multi-factor authentication solutions out there, again, first and foremost, we want you to use what you're using within your organization first with Oracle Business Suite. So if you're using Duo Security, Secure ID tokens, Symantec VIP, Google Authenticator, if you're using these applications throughout the organization for the VPN or for other access, we want you to use those with Oracle Business Suite. Because again, the organization knows that solution. It's widely deployed within the organization potentially. Why implement something different for Oracle Business Suite? We want to make sure that you're implementing the multi-factor authentication that works with your organization, as well as we can make it work with Oracle Business Suite. And depending on the solutions you pick, some of these multi-factor authentication solutions may work or may not work. So it's very important to pick a solution that fits in with Oracle Business Suite, as well as your identity management platform, as well as your multi-factor authentication systems and solutions that you have deployed today. Because again, you don't want to have to deploy a second application to everybody's phone. You want, hey, if you're logging into the VPN using Symantec VIP, hey, use that. That's a very effective solution. Let's hook that up now to Oracle Business Suite. Because again, you've already got it installed on your phone. And again, just like single sign-on, two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication is not directly supported by Oracle Business Suite. It may be supported by the identity management platform. So if you do implement single sign-on, oftentimes as part of the single sign-on, I also get two-factor authentication. But that is only at the login. So when I log into Oracle Business Suite through the single sign-on, I would then be prompted to enter a two-factor authentication at that point. But all the solutions out there that support two-factor authentication with Oracle Business Suite don't allow you to do this within the application. It's kind of just at the login page and that's it. So that's kind of a very key limitation about most solutions out there. And we'll talk about an alternative solution in terms of our AppDefend product that allows you to do this within the application, which becomes very powerful. So again, the two-factor authentication solutions that work with Oracle Business Suite, all the solutions here except for AppDefend are all just at that login page. So like Access Manager, IDCS from Oracle, Okta, SSO Gen, again, they have it two-factor authentication just as part of their SSO solution. So I log in and immediately I get two-factor authentication, but I can't do it once I get into the application. having that in the application is also a critical factor because I can do some very interesting things and some very powerful features within the application that protect the application to an extent not possible before. So this slide now talks about the without complexity of this presentation. So when we talk about implementing these solutions, the biggest challenge and problems for most Oracle E-Business Suite customers is just it's not a simple solution to implement. So this is kind of the classic Oracle Access Manager diagram, shows you the flow, shows you all the servers involved, all the components that have to work together to have an SSO solution with Oracle Business Suite. This is very complex. Working with the clients that we do, this is always an issue. It's always a challenge to get this up and running and maintain it. And where this becomes a challenge in many organizations is that your identity management team doesn't know anything about Oracle Access Manager. Your DBAs don't know anything about Oracle Access Manager. And what happens is this gets thrown onto a team who doesn't want it. They don't want to have to implement a whole nother solution within the organization to say, okay, let's now stand up some Oracle Access Manager servers and try to manage it. So is this managed by the identity management team that says, no, we've got Active Directory, that's our solution. We know that inside and out. We don't want to now have another solution. The Oracle DBAs say, well, it's an Oracle product and it works with Oracle Business Suite. I guess we have to do it, but they're not identity management experts. They're not well versed in this type of product in order to implement it, get it working, and things like that. So we see as much of a challenge as just implementing the hardware, making all the connections working. It's just daily operations of this becomes very complex for many organizations because there's no single team where this logically falls. Because it is an identity management product they have to implement, but your identity management team doesn't want it, and your Oracle team are not identity management experts. And as you can see, the flow diagram to the right, this is not a simple little solution. Things are bouncing around pretty dramatically on how it works, how it connects, and how it makes all these, the SSO actually work. There are other products out there like Okta for Oracle Business Suite. So Okta is a well-known identity management platform. Most people have Active Directory. I would say a minority probably have Okta as their primary identity management. But again, I need another server implemented. So who owns this? At least in this case, the identity management team has selected Okta, so they're a little bit more familiar with the Okta Access Gateway than they would be than another type team that was running like Active Directory. So there's a little bit of benefit here, but again, this is not the robust solution, kind of an add-on to Okta that kind of make it work with Oracle Business Suite. But again, I still need access gate. I still potentially need OID operating in the environment. So how to implement SSO and MFA without the complexity, and the solution for Oracle Business Suite is AppDefend. So AppDefend is an enterprise application firewall designed and optimized for Oracle Business Suite. AppDefend only works with Oracle Business Suite and PeopleSoft. So out of the box, it was designed to be the Oracle Business Suite security solution out there. Not only does it provide SSO and two-factor authentication for Oracle Business Suite, it provides a number of layers of security for the application. First, it prevents web attacks either from known Oracle Business Suite vulnerabilities. So for each Oracle critical patch update vulnerability, AppDefend has virtual patching rules. So it closes that window of vulnerabilities from the time that the security patches come out to when you can apply them, and which for many organizations is 30 to 90 days. Some organizations are even longer. We see a number of customers don't apply the security patches for 6 months. AppDefend closes that window of vulnerability by having specific rules for e-business suite security vulnerabilities patched. On top of that, it provides layers of general protection for well-known classes of security vulnerabilities that are especially problematic in an Oracle Business Suite environment. That includes SQL injection, cross-site scripting, XML entity attacks, Java deserialization. And this layer of protection is so good that for many Oracle Business Suite vulnerabilities that are patched by Oracle, AppDefend provides protection out of the box before we even write virtual patching rules. That's how powerful the web protection is within AppDefend. The second key feature of AppDefend is that it blocks all those Oracle EBS modules. So Oracle has some solutions like the URL firewall, allowed resources. Again, very difficult to configure, complex to maintain. AppDefend provides a much more flexible and capable than the URL firewall and the Oracle native Oracle EBS solution. And we can get down to just doing by module versus having to whitelist page by page. So the core problem with Oracle Business Suite, a key security risk, is that when you install Oracle Business Suite, everyone on this call today is running manufacturing, CRM, Oracle Student System, and all other 250 modules within Oracle Business Suite. And you're like, no, we're only licensed, we've only configured, we've only installed financials. We only have AP, AR, GL, asset management. No, you are running 20,000 web pages in the application. You are running Oracle Student System because you cannot uninstall it. There are 20,000 web pages installed in Oracle Business Suite. All those are available and accessible. Even though you haven't licensed them or configured them, security vulnerabilities in those modules may be exploitable. That's why you want to limit those pages. Oracle has some solutions that are kind of not very good. AppDefend takes that on steroids and provides a very flexible and capable system to actually block those unused modules. The third important feature is application logging. Oracle Business Suite has very good application logging. Unfortunately, if you want to get a full view of all the application logging in Oracle Business Suite, there's about 20 tables you have to look at and about 10 files. To get that into an external repository takes a lot of work. What AppDefend does is, with a simple rule set, can pick all those rules all those audit trails that you would have in Oracle Business Suite, can do it in a centralized location and immediately send it to a centralized logging solution like Splunk, Elasticsearch, Logarithm, ArcSight, whatever you're using for your centralized logging, especially from the IT security team. Immediately send all that information up for visibility and forensic analysis. Very powerful, very feature rich, but simple to implement, and that's the key for most organizations. Most organizations don't do much with application logging because it's too complex. It just takes a lot of time and effort, where AppDefend is out of the box, it works, sends the information up, and everyone can see visibility into the security and the compliance of Oracle Business Suite. The final feature here is a lot of organizations are now implementing web services and mobile applications. For web services, oh, by the way, there's not one web service in Oracle Business Suite. It used to be that each Oracle module team wrote their own web services. So there's actually 11 different web services within Oracle Business Suite. You may be only using one or two, but by the way, a few of them are actually configured by default and working. AppDefend provides the protection for web services, even if it may be SOAP, REST, depending what it is. Mobile applications are being deployed a lot more by organizations. Oh, by the way, this is Oracle Business Suite. So there's actually two mobile service application frameworks. Different protection is required for each because they actually operate differently. The way the calls are made on the back end, they operate differently. So again, AppDefend can provide the layer of protection for the mobile applications, allowing certain mobile applications, blocking others, and protecting malicious traffic and attacks against the protocols that those mobile applications use. And then finally, AppDefend has very robust layers of protection implemented through SSO and two-factor authentication. That's what we'll talk about for the rest of the presentation. How to actually implement SSO and two-factor authentication in Oracle Business Suite without the complexity. And when we talk about complexity, how do you avoid the complexity? And how does AppDefend do it without having additional hardware, additional processes running? The way AppDefend works is it implements as a Java specification servlet filter. So this is very standard Java. This is very standard Weblogic. And so it works just the way that even standard Oracle Business Suite servlet filters work. And it runs within each application server. So the beauty of AppDefend is it becomes part of the application. So when I bring Oracle Business Suite down, AppDefend stops. When I bring Oracle Business Suite up, AppDefend starts automatically with the application. There is no separate processes, no separate server. It's a simple software install, supports Oracle Business Suite fully in terms of shared Apple taps or whatever your configuration is, load balancing, multiple Java containers, all that is fully supported by AppDefend. So it works as part of the application. And it really is part of the application. That's the nice thing about it, because it is embedded in the application it sees everything going on. So everything coming into the application and everything going out of the application, AppDefend can monitor and trigger different rule sets based on if there's attacks, if there's malicious traffic, if there's suspicious activity. AppDefend is monitoring everything and can take action, as well as providing SSO and multi-factor authentication capabilities. So the same AppDefend install provides a wide range of features and capabilities. You can choose to turn on some, turn off others as necessary. So if you want to implement SSO or multi-factor authentication, you can do that. And because it's rule-based, AppDefend can take different actions based on what's happening. So if it's installed on an external application server, it can do different SSO and multi-factor authentication than if it's installed internally. It can also make judgments on, hey, this is an iSupplier user, this is an internal user, this is an employee, this is a regular eBusiness Suite user. So it can actually make all those judgments and actually take different actions. So in terms of SSO and multi-factor authentication, we can actually have different SSO or different multi-factor authentication. So for your internal users, you can do Active Directory SSO. For your external iSupplier users, we can do something like send an SMS message. So specifically the SSO feature, so instead of having to implement additional hardware servers, having to buy access manager, something like that, AppDefend provides native integration with the external identity provider in terms of SSO using a very standard industry standard protocol called SAML. The latest version, SAML 2.0, and which is a very robust, well-used protocol throughout many different web applications, many different identity providers. The key is AppDefend is the glue. This is not a separate server or hardware. It's just a glue between, let's say, Active Directory and Oracle Business Suite. You don't need additional complex setup. It just provides that glue and interaction and direct integration with the identity provider. So again, since it's SAML 2.0, which is a very well-defined industry standard, AppDefend can support any SAML 2.0 identity provider. Generally, the ones that we run into most often, almost everybody wants to do either Active Directory Federated Services. Again, that's just on-premise Active Directory, and there's a small component that runs additionally that almost everyone is running already today called ADFS. Or most people are doing it in the cloud, and it's Azure AD, which is Microsoft Azure Active Directory in the cloud. And then we have some customers who are running Okta, OneLogin, Ping Identity. We actually have a few customers actually running custom solutions for identity management. The really nice thing with AppDefend is that it's very flexible. So we can support many different implementations. So Oracle Business Suite has a standard way of doing single sign-on. So when you hook up Access Manager to Oracle Business Suite, you're using the SSO provider setup using system profile options and things within Oracle Business Suite. AppDefend fully supports that configuration. However, in certain cases, you want to just maybe do direct SSO. You don't want to set up all those profile options. You may want to have a number of different user communities within Oracle Business Suite and make a determination on who does what, versus having to go through and pick and choose which users are SSO and non-SSO. You may want to potentially have a different way to do it. AppDefend fully supports that also, as well as fully supporting Web API, mobile applications, configurator, etc. And then finally, when we talk about security of an SSO implementation, all the external SSO implementations, including Oracle Access Manager, Oracle Identity, Cloud Services, all require you to change the EBS session cookie from host to domain. Since most of the people on the call today will be Oracle people, this probably doesn't mean anything to you, but your IT security people would be very curious to see that line, the last line on the slide here, to say, yeah, that's actually a problem. And what this means is that if there's a domain out there and a host that has the same domain name as your Oracle Business Suite environment, so again, the domain is, you chop off the host name and then you have the domain left. If there's another host out there and you connect to Oracle Business Suite, log in, and then in the same browser, even in a different tab, connect to another website within your organization with the same domain, they can read your session cookie. Then they can just take that session cookie, pop it into a browser, and actually log into Oracle Business Suite as your user, as your current session. Oracle eBusiness Suite natively does not have protection against that. AppDefend can provide some protection against that, but natively Oracle Business Suite doesn't protect against that. So therefore, the AppDefend solution is the most secure SSO implementation available for Oracle. How does this all work? Again, this works very similar to like Access Manager and Oracle Internet Directory. But what happens is the user logs into Oracle Business or accesses Oracle Business Suite just as they would today normally. What happens instead of just logging in, AppDefend takes the session and redirects it to the identity provider. That could be Active Directory, that could be Azure AD, it could be Okta in this case, in this slide. And then you log in through that identity provider, and then that identity provider sends a response back that AppDefend then interprets, validates, and then creates the sign-on for Oracle Business Suite and logs the person in and sends them to the Oracle Business Suite homepage. So again, you can't get into Oracle Business Suite unless you go through the identity provider, and that becomes a single source of truth. So again, if someone is terminated in Active Directory, they cannot log into Oracle Business Suite. That's where the benefit of this comes in. They only need one username, one password, and then they can access Oracle Business Suite with that information. So very simple flow. Behind the scenes, it's a little bit more complex, so we won't go through all the steps here. But again, there's a lot of validation, a lot of security checks here to make sure that the person who is accessing Oracle Business Suite is properly authenticated and is actually who they should be. A key aspect is there are a number of security challenges in this implementation. AppDefend takes care of that for you and has a very robust and very secure implementation that prevents. There are some issues around SAML in terms of replay attacks, invalid XML because it is an XML-based protocol. AppDefend has protections against all that. This is very secure. It's signing, it's encrypting the information being sent back and forth using the latest advanced encryption standards. SHA-512 is used natively within AppDefend, and therefore is well protected on the interaction here. So again, we believe AppDefend SSO is the most secure SSO solution for Oracle Business Suite because there are inherent risks in the other solutions on the way they work and the way they have to work external to Oracle Business Suite. But by being part of Oracle Business Suite, being integrated into the application, AppDefend can avoid those security weaknesses that are inherent in the other solutions. Another feature that many of our clients who have implemented AppDefend SSO really rely on is when you have a mess within your organization between your identity provider and your Oracle Business Suite, due to acquisitions, just organizational changes over time, those types of things, many organizations, the user IDs, the names, et cetera, in the identity provider don't even come close to matching what's in Oracle Business Suite. And you may have different levels. You may have 5 acquisitions, so all the usernames, some usernames may be email address, some may be first letter, last name, some may be employee ID, things like that. A very powerful capability of AppDefend is that it can provide that mapping and that translation between the identity provider IDs and Oracle Business Suite. We can do it on some simple ways that, again, the identity provider, you may have the employee email address set up with an identity provider, but that may not be their username, but that may be set up in FND user as their email address. AppDefend can do all that matching. To make it even more powerful, we can get down to regular expressions and transformations and have multiple transformations. So if you have some users that are employee ID, other ones are first letter, first name, then full last name, those types of things, we can provide all those translations. So this becomes very powerful where we've had some clients that have not been able to implement other SSO solutions because they just couldn't get the user IDs to match, and it would be significant effort and time to try to put all that information into the identity provider, try to manage it and get it all working, where they were able to very quickly get SSO up and running with Oracle Business Suite through AppDefend because we could do this mapping without having to spend months. And one client said, well, it'll probably take us a couple of years to try to get all that information correct and working. And within a week, we had the mappings done correctly and AppDefend was up and running. So again, another feature that AppDefend brings to the table that other SSO providers can't match. So that's SSO. So AppDefend for multi-factor authentication now brings not only multi-factor authentication to the application, but contextual multi-factor authentication. So when we talk about contextual multi-factor authentication, this is beyond the sign-on page. So most multi-factor authentication solutions concentrate just on the sign-on page. What happens if I want to do it for different users and have different types of authentication? What happens if I want to do it down to a specific page or responsibility, or even down to a function? AppDefend can do that. So because AppDefend is embedded in the application, we see every page access, what's happening. So if you want to get down to the employee direct deposit bank account change page, we can pop up a separate multi-factor authentication on that page. And AppDefend works with different MFA solutions. So Duo Security, TOTP, that's the Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator type applications that are on your phone that you bring up, you type any of the 6-digit code. We can do SMS messages. So again, you get an SMS message to your mobile phone, you have to type in the 6 or 8-digit code. We can even do private key encryption using smart cards like YubiKey, DoD, smart cards we can support also. So very capable, very feature rich in terms of both the breadth of solutions in terms of multi-factor authentication to also where you can do it in the application. So this is application aware. You can do it at the login, user responsibility, function, or page level, and you can have different multi-factor authentications in the same application based on different use cases and controls you need. So if you have users would come in, they would be popped up with one two-factor authentication, but when you log in as like the sysadmin user, you could pop up a different two-factor authentication solution. So we have some clients who run RSA secure ID tokens for all their users, but when sysadmin doesn't have one, so they would use Duo Security. So in the same application, depending on the user, we can pop up different two-factor authentication. This can be also very context aware in terms of the session. So again, if you have someone coming in from China at 2 a.m. Eastern time, we can block that based on the two-factor authentication or pop up a two-factor authentication. So normally when you're in the US office on a US IP address during normal business hours, you're just in. You don't have to do a two-factor authentication. However, if you aren't in that situation, you may be coming in through the VPN, you may be coming in from a remote sales office at off hours, we can pop up a two-factor authentication in that case. So therefore, it's kind of user experience. We can pop up one two-factor authentication per session, or we can pop up multiple. And again, all this is logged, so we can log based on when these authentications are happening, when the authentications are failing. We can send alerts immediately up to the security team if two-factor authentications are failing, things like that. And the great thing about the two-factor authentication here with AppDefend is this is independent of the single sign-on. So if you have single sign-on, it can work with that. If you use the local EBS authentication, it can work with that. If you have a mixture, because again, you may have your internal users are single sign-on, but your supplier users are local authentication, AppDefend fully supports that. And there is no additional hardware single point of failure here because this is installed on each Oracle Business Suite application server. So there's no additional hardware. If one of your application servers goes down, that's not a problem because again, you're hopefully load balancing that can take over. And then finally, we fully support everything that Oracle supports in terms of single sign-on, in terms of web API, configurator, mobile apps, etc. So again, it has you covered. So let's talk about a few use cases here. So generally, the major use case is the entire application. So when I sign on to the application, I want two-factor authentication. I just want to make sure the person is get past the username password in case that is attacked, phished, or something like that. What we see is most organizations need different two-factor authentications based on their set of user population. So you can use Active Directory, you can use something like your RSA tokens or dual security for your internal users, but you don't want to roll that out to your suppliers. So for your suppliers, we can use like Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator with a self-registration. So when you self-register for the supplier, then they actually have the Google Authenticator on their phone. Therefore, you don't have to pay for that. It's kind of a free solution. They can use whatever solution they have on their phone because, again, they may already have at least Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator. Works perfectly in that environment, and now you're providing that layer of security. We can also do it for privilege responsibility. So we can pop up when someone logs in and they use System Administrator, we can then require another two-factor authentication or just rely on the same one. Again, now we're trying to protect these highly privileged responsibilities from malicious use. A key one that we see a lot of implementation today, because the external auditors are now getting smart to this one, is you have these highly privileged generic accounts in Oracle Business Suite, like sysadmin. For concurrent manager, you may have generic accounts for all those concurrent manager jobs running. Well, if those are some of those are general ledger posting jobs under a generic account, that's basically pretty much a SOX issue, right? That's kind of a weakness if you've got a generic account that 10 people may have access to. How do you know who is accessing that? Again, we can now pop up a two-factor authentication, and depending on the solution here, like Duo Security, we can assign out users their devices to a single account. So you set up sysadmin in Duo Security, you assign individual named user devices to that account. So now I've tied my logins into sysadmin to named users, and I have an audit trail for that. And I can also limit who can access it. So in Duo Security, hey, I've got all my users probably already, if I'm using that as a solution, I already have all my users set up with their devices. I can now assign those individual users to a new account called sysadmin. And so not only do I limit access to the generic account to who I want, I also have a full audit trail of when that named user used that generic account. That solves the compliance challenge. We've got a number of customers who basically just said then, you basically just paid for the product by giving us that capability because we had a weakness from our external auditor. And external auditors are coming after these privileged accounts because it is a challenge, it is an issue within Oracle Business Suite. And then finally, the one feature that we see based on fraud is high-risk functions. So requiring, like when you access the self-service HR bank accounts page, how do you do that? How do you limit access to that? How do you actually pop up another two-factor authentication to know who the person is if they've been phished to prevent that level of fraud? That's a very powerful control in Oracle Business Suite. And again, AppDefend multi-factor authentication is the only way today that you can do these contextual multi-factor authentication. Because again, your SSO solution like Oracle Access Manager, Oracle Internet Directory can do multi-factor authentication, but it can't do it contextually. So what we'll do now is kind of jump out, give you a very quick demo of this capability. Oops, one screen too far. I'll make this a little bit bigger so everyone can see it. So this is, again, an example Oracle Business Suite production environment. And when you're thinking about SSO and multi-factor authentication, you do need to think about, hey, I've got internal users. In this case, they would be accessing the production environment here. I have local users. So even though I have all my named users, I still have sysadmin. I still have potentially generic concurrent manager account. So I still always need to do some local logins in Oracle Business Suite. That is kind of a given. That's something where you need to have a control on how do you control those. Again, the two-factor authentication becomes very powerful here. And then finally, I may have some external users. In this case, in this example, we're doing iSupplier. So how I want to handle my iSupplier users versus my internal users is going to be very different. So what we'll do is we'll do an example here. We'll kind of log in now as a named user. And so in this case, when I click that link, now it has popped me onto, and this is Azure AD, it's now popped me into an Azure AD login page. So what's happened is that connected to Oracle Business Suite, and then redirected me to an Azure AD page. So now I'll actually log in as Azure AD. So this is my single sign-on. This is my single source of truth in Azure AD for all my web applications across the enterprise. And now I'll sign in. And now I'm redirected to Oracle Business Suite. So that's kind of how powerful this is that I missed you didn't see the Oracle Business Suite sign-in page here because I went to Azure AD and now we've actually returned back to Oracle Business Suite logged in as the appropriate user. I've got a full audit trail in Azure AD. I've provided a number of checks around the account. I can actually do some very sophisticated risk analysis about that login within Azure AD. So now I've protected the application here. And now when I log out, I now pop back to, in this case, it's going to be actually a Microsoft application page. Make it a little bit bigger so you can see it. So again, I've just got a link here, and this could be all my list of web applications. And I can now actually just click this again. And again, I'm logged into Azure AD here as a user. And now I don't even get prompted again for a username or password. I'm right back into the application because, again, I was authenticated already in Azure AD. Now I can go in. And this works the exact same way if it's on-premise Active Directory, if it's Okta, Ping Identity, or any other SAML solution. The process is the same. I've now hooked that up. We can typically get this running for a client within about an hour and a half, fully working. Let's match that with any other SSO solution out there. Because again, we're just a simple add-in, a simple integration into Oracle Business Suite that provides a very robust, complex, single sign-on solution for the application, but it's very simple to deploy, very simple to manage. In this case, I'll log back out. And in this case, I'm actually going to have to log out of Azure AD here. So now I'm now fully logged out. There it goes. Now I'll pop back here. So again, this is now what we'll do is simulate a iSupplier user. Again, this is the same Oracle Business Suite environment. But now my iSupplier is running on my external node. We are now doing a different type of authentication here because I don't want to set up those people in my Azure AD because my suppliers that's a one-off. This is the only application they may be accessing for us. And so now I'll actually log in as a supplier. And now this is different. Now I'm popping up for an authenticator application. So this is the first time I'm now registering. I'm doing a self-registration with the user. And so now this is powerful that I can now have the user register on their own. They'll now go in. I'm doing this on my phone behind the scenes. I'm now scan that QR code. This is now in Google Authenticator. I can pick the app I want. You can suggest one for them. And again, this page is fully customizable, so you can do it any way you want. And now I can actually type in the code, and I register, and I'm in the application. And what we'll do here is sign out again. And so that was the first time registration, but now the second time they go in, we'll actually see a little different. You remember the password for this account, it'll be a lot easier. Oops, sorry about that. Now this is the second time in. So again, I already registered. And again, if you don't have your phone, you can always, there's recovery codes and there's a lot of different options here. And you can also have a reset capability that your vendor management team can have so they can actually reset this just with a click on the vendor page. And now I verify. Oops. And then again, you have to enter the code within 30 seconds. So it's best not to talk. And again, I'm back now into the application. So what we'll do here is turn it back over to Phil to see if we have any questions.
Sorry about that, I was on mute. Yes, we have definitely have some questions here and a story. So if I don't get to the story, I'll pass it on when we do the thank you email that goes out. First question: what are the Oracle licensing implications if Oracle runs on the EBS Weblogic server?
You definitely need to check with Oracle on this, but for other clients, because it's just a filter, it's not considered a custom application deployed. Therefore, we don't believe that there's any other additional licensing for Weblogic.
Next question. Our users can connect EBS over different classification of networks. Because this is a jar file integrated in the Weblogic, can it use different AD servers based on the network people connect from? Can the browser that is connecting from redirect to different AD servers for the same SAML tokens?
Absolutely. That's one of the key features because, again, AppDefend is a rule-based solution. We can make determinations about which, and again, we're just behind the scenes, it's rules and actions. And based on those rules, we can direct it to different actions, and the actions can be different SAML providers. So based on some attribute, criteria, IP address, whatever, we can actually redirect those users to different SAML servers for authentication. So that is definitely a capability, and we have a lot of customers who, again, if you've been in an organization that actually had different domains, we can send it to different domains, either based on usernames or other parameters for sure.
Next question. Can a user be set up for his own EBS account and an administrative account?
Absolutely. So again, a lot of the questions we always get is, oh, can you do this? Can you do that? And the answer is almost always yes. There's only occasionally do we run into something, and that's usually kind of with a different provider that we haven't worked with before that doesn't support the protocol of like SAML or some of the multi-factor authentication. So yes, you can have different accounts. And in that case, if they have their own EBS account and an admin account, the EBS account can be through Active Directory, but the local admin account can be still a local authorization.
Here's another question, which I've seen in the same ilk, I think. The application can have a feature to use any kind of dictionary? ?
Yeah, so for single sign-on, we can use any SAML 2.0 compatible system. We have a few clients that either have their own or something that we've never seen before. So definitely anything that's SAML 2.0 is supported.
And follow-up question, any integration with Artho, AUTHO?
Yes, we can definitely work with Auth0. So depending on some of the different web providers, we can definitely work with those. We're also coming out with Connect ID support as well as native Active Directory. So you don't need Active Directory federated services. We'll actually be able to work with Active Directory directly. So yes, if we don't work with it today, if there's enough potential clients, we definitely will implement it because again, this is just a single action. So for like our SAML implementation, it's just one Java class that's implemented. It's fairly large and robust, but there's not a lot of effort for us because where we reside is not a whole different integration. It's basically just adding in a connector and an integration within AppDefend. And that's why we can support so many different multi-factor authentication services.
The last question here is based on licenses. And the question is the license based on number of users or processor based?
AppDefend is based on ranges of users. So for the SSO and multi-factor authentication, we have user ranges, which are fairly broad. So this is not one of those solutions. Every time you add a user, you have to actually talk to us. We do a fairly broad number ranges that you can fit within. So therefore, we kind of just reevaluate those every year or so if you've kind of dramatically grown. But this is kind of a very simple, easy solution to implement, as well as easy to license. We work very much with you. This is not an Oracle-based licensing exercise. This is basically a friendly licensing exercise where we work with you to make it work. The other advantage of AppDefend is test and development is free. We only license on production. We want you to run AppDefend in all your test and development environments, both for security of those environments as well as so you can make sure it works properly with any integrations you have, other integrations and things like that. So it's only based on a production license, and all test and development is free.
Well, good job, Steve. You just answered the last question without me having even asked the question. So I'm afraid that ends our session for the day also. Be sure to stay tuned for next Thursday, the 31st of March, for the next e-learning webinar, which is EBS 12.1.3. Support is ended, so how do you stay secure? So thanks again for spending time with us today, and have a good rest of the week. Take care.